back to our course on Excel 2019 Advanced. In the previous section we started looking at tables and we saw how to create tables either from scratch or from existing data, and we also saw how to change a table back into a range, and we looked at some of the functions or some of the things that you can do with tables in Excel, and in particular we looked at some of the advantages of using tables. In this section I'm going to look in some more detail at working with tables, and I'm going to start by looking at how we can make a table bigger by adding rows, removing rows, adding columns, etc. Now I'm going to continue looking at the order details table on the invoice that we're developing, and just before I make this table bigger I want to just click in a couple of the cells in the last row. So this one contains the part number. This one contains a formula, which is a lookup to find the particular part in the catalogue sheet, and we have various other formulae for looking up the price and so on. If I want to add rows to this table, I have a number of ways of doing it, and one of the simplest ways is by dragging it. Now if I hover over the corner of the table, you'll see I have that familiar double-headed arrow, and it's diagonal, which means that I can drag it horizontally or vertically. But when you're working in tables in Excel, you can do either, but you can only do either vertical or horizontal in one operation. Vertical will add rows and horizontal will add columns. So let's start by adding a row or two to this table. I'm going to click and drag, and let me just drag it down one row. Now what happens when I click and drag down one row is that I appear to get an empty row, which is great. And if I click in cell C12, you'll see it's empty. But if I click in cell D12, it's not empty at all. And what Excel has done is to fill down the formula for me. And in fact, in all of the columns where there are formulas, Excel automatically fills that formula down for me. So it does quite a bit more than insert an empty row. So that's a pretty easy way of inserting a row, and I'm sure you won't be surprised to learn that there are several other ways of doing so. For instance, if I click in cell H12, so that's the last row in the body of the table, if I hit the Tab key, I get the same behavior that I do in, say, an application like Word. I get a new row added automatically. And of course, in this case, Excel fills down the formula for me as well. And in fact, there is another way that I can do this. Let me switch off the totals row for just one moment. And what I'm going to do is click in the first empty cell here underneath the final row. Now if I start using these cells, so supposing I put in here 2 of something, that automatically becomes a row in my table. Now that only works if I've switched off the totals row. But having added a row that way, I can switch the totals row back on again and everything will be fine. Now what has happened in this case is a feature of autocorrect, and you can disable this feature if you want to, but if you look at that little lightning bolt, you've got an undo for table auto expansion. You can also say that if you want to stop auto expanding tables, and in fact you can control it a little bit more permanently than that by going into the Excel autocorrect options, because the features whereby the extra row is added automatically when you start typing in it is part of autocorrect on the auto format as you type tab. There are 2 checkboxes there, so include new rows and columns in a table and fill formulas in tables to create calculated columns. I'm going to leave those switched on, but it is easy for you to switch them off if you don't want to use them. Having said that, I'm actually going to clear the number 2 that I just added into this table, and I'm going to switch the totals row back on. Now something else I'm sure you won't be surprised by is the fact that you can also insert a row by selecting a row in the table. And with a right click, one of the options is Insert, and you have 2 options, table columns to the left or table rows above. So let's select that last option. And there you go, you have another row inserted into your table. Another very important option on the Table Tools Design tab is the Resize Table option. This brings up the Resize Table dialog, which actually lets you completely change the size of the table quite dramatically if you wish. Now, having said that, there is a very important note. The headers must remain in the same row, and the resulting table range must overlap the original table range. So you can't change the row that the header is in, and there must be an overlap. For instance, you couldn't specify within that range box there that the first cell is J6, because then you wouldn't have an overlap with the existing table. And you couldn't put the top row in any row other than row 6. But subject to those restrictions, you can use this to make a very dramatic change to the size of the table. So the use of the Resize Table option is one way of adding a column to a table. Of course, there are many other ways. I'm going to cancel this. And of course, another very straightforward way is to click immediately to the right of the column. And I'm going to type the heading in stock. And of course, that automatically becomes part of the table. Once again, you've got that lightning bolt there to control that behavior. And of course, just as we did before, you have the right-click sub-menu. And if you go to Insert, this time you can select to insert columns to the left, to the right, or table rows above again. Just one small word of warning here. Sometimes when you're inserting rows and columns in a table in Excel and you have a particular style of table, sometimes the insert can upset the border. So sometimes when you expect a thin border, you get a thick border. So occasionally you have to do a bit of manual repair work to get the border consistent again, but it's usually pretty straightforward to do that. When it comes to deleting rows and columns, that's also pretty straightforward. If I click somewhere, so let's say in this new In Stock column, and right-click, one of the options is Delete. And I can choose from here to delete table columns or table rows. So in this instance, we're going to say Table Columns. And of course, I could do the same with rows. So I'm going to highlight 2, right-click, delete, and I'm going to say delete table rows this time. When it comes to making selections in a table, it's pretty straightforward to do the regular kinds of selection that we're all used to, but you can also do some very specific selections as well. I have a single cell selected here, so cell D12, and if I right-click and go to the Select sub-menu, you'll see I have two options related to the column. I have Select the Table Column Data, so let's try that. And this will just select cells between the header and totals row, but not the header and totals row themselves. If I say Select Entire Table Column, of course it selects the entire table column. And of course the other option is Table Row, and that selects the entire table row. Another useful point here is that, for example, if I have a whole row selected like this and I right-click and go to Select, I get the same option. And if I was to click on Table Column Data, I've got all of the columns for the data part of the table. I've got all of the columns for the data part of the table for all of the rows. So it's everything in the table except the whole of the header row and the whole of the totals row. Now there are keyboard shortcut equivalents. I'm not going to go into those now, but if you do use keyboard shortcuts, so keyboard shortcuts like Control Space will cycle you through the options. In terms of using the mouse, if I hover my mouse over the left-hand edge of a row, you'll see I get a little black arrow, and if I click, it will highlight the entire row. I could do the same for columns, so I'm going to hover over column D, get my little black arrow and click, and I get to highlight that column, excluding the header row and the totals row. If I hover my mouse in the top left-hand corner, you'll see I get a diagonal arrow, and if I click, it will highlight the main body of data within the table, again excluding that header row and totals row. Click again and I get the entire table, inclusive of the header and totals row. Click once again and I'm just back to the data part. So those are some selections that you can make using your mouse. So that's it on the main features of working with tables. What I want to move on to in the next section is table references. So